Hello, class, and welcome to Social Psychology. In today's lecture, we're going to explore conformity, compliance, and obedience. These are three fascinating and fundamental concepts in social psychology that really reveal the powerful ways in which our behavior, our attitudes, and our beliefs can be shaped by others. We're going to dive into some of the mechanisms behind why we tend to follow the group, why we tend to yield to requests, and sometimes even obey authority figures, even when doing so goes against our personal values and our better judgment. And these topics are especially relevant because they touch almost every part of our lives, from the subtle influences of social media trends to various serious instances of obedience in high-stakes situations. And so understanding these social processes gives us insight into human behavior and decision-making. And so we'll examine some foundational experiments, we'll discuss some real-life applications, and reflect on some of the ethical dimensions of these studies, some of which spark some major debates within psychology. So, as always, I want to kind of cover what we're going to be looking at in today's lecture. So, as always, start off with a little story about a key figure in social psychology, and then we'll dive into conformity, which really involves changing one's behavior or attitudes to align with the norms or the expectations of the group. And it's about fitting in, whether this is consciously or unconsciously, in order to avoid standing out or in order to engage social acceptance, essentially. And we'll explore some classic studies. Particularly, we'll look at Solomon Asch's conformity experiments that highlight how people's decisions can be influenced by group pressure, even in situations where they may know the group is wrong. And we'll discuss some factors that influence conformity, such as what's the size of the group, or is there unanimity in the group, and cultural variations between those. And then we'll take a look at compliance, which is the act of agreeing to a request from another person, often influenced by some social pressure or some persuasion techniques. Now, this is a little bit different from conformity because compliance does not necessarily require a change in your private beliefs. Instead, it involves outward behavior in response to direct or indirect requests. And so we'll examine some strategies, one being the foot in the door technique, and the other being the door in the face technique. And these are things that are widely used in marketing and personal persuasion and sales. And then finally, we'll take a look at obedience. And obedience goes one step further and allows, really kind of involves direct orders or commands from an authority figure. And this form of social influence can lead people to act in ways that they may not otherwise choose, even when the consequences are significant. And so, of course, we need to take a look at Stanley Milgram's controversial obedience studies, which really show that ordinary individuals could follow commands to harm others under the right circumstances. So, in today's story about a prominent social psychologist, I want to introduce you to Solomon Asch, who really was a foundational figure in the whole field of social psychology. He was born in Warsaw, Poland in 1907, and then he moved to the United States in his early teen years, where he studied psychology and eventually earned his PhD from the Ivy League School in New York of Columbia University. Asch's most famous research is called the Asch conformity experiment. And he did a lot of studies, and his studies really kind of demonstrated the powerful effect of group influence on individual judgments. Now, we'll kind of dive into it a little more deeply as the lecture goes on, but really, one of the key concepts that we get from Asch is the whole idea of normative social influence, which is basically the idea that people conform to a group in order to be liked or accepted by others. So we give up something of our own personal opinion in order to be a member of a group. And also that there's informational social influence. That is basically the idea that conforming because one's believes the group has better information. So sometimes it's about giving up because we trust that other people know better than us, when maybe they don't. And his work highlighted the impact of different things like group unanimity and group size, as well as when is it that it's good to dissent from others in a group. And really what we have from the legacy of Dr. Solomon Asch is that there's a lot of contexts where groups really exercise a lot of power over us and persuade us to do things that we wouldn't normally do. And that these powers of group pressure or group dynamics and social environment really do shape a lot of what we do within life. And we need to be mindful of those things as we live our lives and move through and kind of develop relationships. Now, let's start off with our first theme in this lecture, which is the idea of conformity, which is the act of adjusting one's behaviors and attitudes or beliefs to align with those of a group or to a social norm. And this influence can be subtle or it can be really overt. And it really kind of arises from our desire to fit in, to avoid conflict, or even gain approval from others. So we're giving up something in order to gain that acceptance. And there's two key theories to conformity. The first one is the theory suggests that people conform in order to be liked or accepted or to avoid rejection from the group. We value acceptance by the group more than a lot of other things. And it's basically when our sense is that we are drawing our sense of self from the group, we will do a lot in order to get social approval and in order to help us avoid negative judgments. And when we're in this kind of situations, we're more likely to conform to the group. So normative social influence often leads to public compliance, where individuals might outwardly agree with the group, but not necessarily believe it internally. And in situations where we are uncertain or believe others know more, we may conform to align with what we think is the correct behavior or belief. And here the group serves as a source of information, especially in ambiguous or unfamiliar contexts. And this type of influence is likely to lead to private acceptance, where individuals truly believe the group's view to be correct. So it's in those kind of situations of informational social influence where if there is some kind of evidence that they know more than me, then I'm going to accept that. And tied in with this, then, of course, is Solomon Asch's experiment, which provides the illustration of normative social influence. Now, as we discussed, Asch found that individuals often conform to groups' incorrect answer, even when the correct answer was obvious. So the experiment shows that, and the idea was, kind of looking at lines, and in those lines asking which one's the longest. And one person would say one thing and the cohort would say something different. And so people would, even though they clearly were right, would give up that in order to accept what other people say. And that just shows that conformity is very powerful. And so group unanimity is the idea that group conformity increased when the group was unanimous in their incorrect response. However, if one person dissented, the conformity rate dropped off significantly. There's also the idea of group size. So Ash found that conformity increased the group with group size. But it really kind of plateaued when the group reached around 4 or 5 people. So the kind of the optimum is, if you have 4 or 5 people that are saying something is true and you're saying something is false, and they're all in uniform unanimity, then you tend to go along with them. And finally, task difficulty. When the task is more difficult or ambiguous, people are more likely to conform due to informational social influence. And that's basically the idea that we in our heads, we kind of do this automatic math that kind of decides, okay, is this task too hard for me to figure out? Or can I just trust the group? And oftentimes our mind will just say, okay, I'm just going to trust the group here because I don't want to expend really the effort to be critical and to evaluate this. So that's something that is part of Ash's conformity experiment as well. And if you recall, we also, last week, we talked a little bit about Muzaffar Sharif. And I want to kind of talk about something known as his autokinetic effect experiment, which kind of deals with the whole informational social influence. So back in the 1930s, Sharif used the autokinetic effect, which is basically a visual illusion where a stationary point of light appears to move in a dark room. And he did this in order to study how people conform in ambiguous situations. And when participants were asked to estimate the light's movement alone, they gave varying responses. However, when placed in a group, their estimates converged, showing that people tend to rely on each other to make sense of an uncertain situation. So it's really, the reality then becomes kind of a social construct, that information is kind of merged with each other, and so we come up with kind of a more harmonious interpretation of reality. Now, building on the foundational theories and studies of conformity, I want to turn now to some real-world examples, because conformity is not limited to controlled experiments. So, one of the most visible examples of conformity today is in fashion and social media. So there's trends that spread very rapidly as individuals look at their peers and their influencers and celebrities to look for what are the cues on what to wear or what to eat or how to behave. And these trends are often driven by normative social influences. And so there's a desire to be accepted and admired by others. And this kind of ties in with a couple of things. You can also think in terms of groupthink, which is that whole phenomenon that occurs when there's a desire to have harmony and conformity in the decision-making of a group. And that sometimes can obviously lead to irrational or dysfunctional decisions. And often individuals suppress their doubts to maintain unity, which can result in poor decisions. So groupthink is commonly observed in high-stakes environments, such as corporate boardrooms or governmental organizations, where the pressure to agree with the group can outweigh individual judgment. And then finally, conformity also affects behavior in professional settings. So when employees often align their behavior with the norms and expectations of their organization. So while this can help maintain productivity and harmony, it can also lead to a reluctance to speak out against unethical practices. So studies in organizational behavior have shown that employees often hesitate to report issues like discrimination due to normative pressures to conform to worse workplace culture. So those are some things to kind of keep in mind. And now let's take a look at compliance. And compliance involves a change in behavior that results from a direct or an indirect request from another person or from a group. So this is different from conformity, where the influence is often implicit. Compliance, on the other hand, has a very explicit, clear request, though it doesn't necessarily come from an authority figure. So here you can have, there's different techniques for strategies for compliance. So there's the compliance strategy, which involves making a small request that a person is likely to agree to, followed by a larger request. So research shows that once someone agrees to a minor request, they are more likely to comply to a subsequent larger request, possibly because they feel a need to be consistent in their behavior. Now, for instance, if a charity successfully asks you to sign a petition, they may later ask you to make a donation, to which you're more likely to agree. And so that's the foot in the door technique, where you make a small request and then once they comply with that, then you make a larger request. And because they've already complied to the one, they're likely to comply to the other. Another technique is what we call the door in the face technique, which kind of takes the opposite approach, where the requester begins with just a crazy, unreasonable large request that is likely to be rejected. And then they ask for something more moderate, a more reasonable request. And the idea is that after refusing the large request, people are more likely to agree to the smaller one, because it seems more acceptable by comparison. So, for example, a salesperson might initially offer an expensive product, and after you decline, they'll suggest something that's more affordable for you. Now, another way you can think of is the lowball technique, and we've probably all heard of the lowball technique. And this is where people initially offer something at a lower cost or effort, only to have additional terms added on later. And car sales are an example of this, where the customer might agree to buy a car at a low price, but during the process, extra fees or features are introduced. Having already committed, the buyer often feels pressured to comply to these additional costs. Now, often used in marketing is the "that's not all" technique. And you probably heard that in infomercials. That's not all, folks. You also get this, this, and this. And that's where you sweeten the deal before the person can make a decision. So, for instance, a salesperson might offer a product at a regular price, but then at a quote-unquote bonus item, just to make it more appealing. And the goal is to make the person feel they're receiving extra value, increasing the likelihood of compliance. So you can see there's a lot of ways that we can be manipulated into compliance by these things. It's about shaping the first decision so that we make a decision that kind of conforms to that expectation. And there's some different factors that go into compliance. The first one would be that people often feel obliged to return a favor. The whole idea of reciprocity, that if you do something for me, I'll do something for you. So sometimes people will say, for example, give you a free sample, and then you kind of feel a little bit of social pressure to buy that product just in order to return the favor. They were nice to you, you should be nice to them. That kind of idea. And then there's the idea of consistency, and this is where that foot in the door technique comes in, where you commit to a small action that's helpful in some way, and then because you've complied to that small action, then they might make a larger request, and that's still in line with that smaller request, and so you accept that as well. So that would be the idea of consistency. And then there's the idea of authority, where some requests from individuals perceived as knowledgeable or authoritative. When you have an expert in the field making a request, you're more likely to comply to that request. And then there's the whole idea of scarcity. And the idea of scarcity is that, if you advertise, for a limited time offer, or there's only a few in stock left, that kind of idea, it's like, if I don't make this decision now, I might miss out. And so it's kind of like it's pressuring you to basically make a decision. And it's enticing you to make the decision emotionally based upon the idea of scarcity. And these ideas can go a long ways to moving someone to a place of compliance. Now, there are a lot of real-world techniques that kind of go into this. And there's different compliance techniques that might not be quite so ethical. One of them would be, for example, the bait and switch. So this is the method that involves attracting individuals with a really appealing offer and then switching to a less attractive or more costly offer once your interest is piqued. So, for example, a store might advertise a significant discount on a popular product only to reveal that that item is out of stock and when the customer arrives. However, they may offer an alternative item at a higher price, counting on the customer's initial commitment and investment of time to lead to a purchase. So you sometimes can see this. We'll take like the Cybertruck, for example. Cybertruck, Cyberbeast, let's say it's $100,000. You know, it's got tri-motors, it's all decked out and normally be $100,000, and a car dealer advertises it for $50,000. It's like, whoa, what an amazing deal. I'm going to go in and try to get this Cyberbeast. And you go in, and lo and behold, they say, oh, no, sorry, that one's not available. It's already been purchased. But look here, we have another Cybertruck that's only $80,000 or $90,000. How about that? And since you came there looking for this great deal and getting in your mind the whole idea of getting a Cybertruck, now all of a sudden you're halfway to making that decision already of compliance. So oftentimes people will do that. And so those are just some examples of different ways of doing compliance. Now, I want to take a little bit of time and move now to another type of social influence where individuals follow direct commands or orders from an authority figure. So this is different from compliance because compliance isn't necessarily from someone in authority, but obedience is, say, taking direction from your boss or from someone who is perceived to be an authority figure. So like a scientist or a doctor or something. And obedience is particularly relevant in situations where there's a structured hierarchy, like in a workplace, or even more truly in military settings. In fact, military structures are set up for social obedience. Or it might be in legal institutions, which paramilitary situations like police stations and stuff like that, or corrections, they all kind of tie in with this whole idea of obedience as well. Where following instructions from authority figures is expected. Now, obedience, remember, differs from compliance in that it usually involves a very clear power differential, with the individual obeying someone seen as an authority figure. Now, obedience is often essential for social order and coordination, so there is a place for it. Yet it can lead to some really troubling consequences when authority figures give harmful or unethical commands. So this tension exists when obedience in a critical area takes this unethical turn. So this is why obedience is such an important topic to study in social psychology. So the first theory that I want to introduce on obedience is the idea of social impact theory. And so this theory suggests that the likelihood of obedience is influenced by three main factors. First off, the strength or the importance of the authority figure, the immediacy, that is the closeness in time and space of the authority figure, and finally the number of people giving the command. So the stronger, the more immediate, and the numerous the authority figures, the greater the social impact and likelihood of obedience. So let's take the military, for example. In the military, you have, like, let's take a tank, for example. You have three guys: the driver, the loader, and the commander. And basically what you have is one person giving the commands and the other two following. And because that person that's in command is immediate and close and seen as the authority, and has the backing of other authorities, the likelihood that others are going to follow them is very strong. Okay, there's also something known as the agentic state theory. This is something from Stanley Milgram. And his theory posits that people are more likely to obey when they enter an agentic state, which means in this state, individuals see themselves as agents that are responsible for carrying out another person's wishes. So that's why it's called the agentic state, because they are playing a role of the agent of the desires of another person, thereby diminishing their sense of responsibility. They don't feel personally responsible because they're just doing what someone commanded them to do. And the agentic state explains why people might commit acts that they would typically consider wrong when instructed by an authority figure. Now, there's also, obedience also ties in with the moral and morality, because there's something known as the moral disengagement theory. And this theory is often applied to obedience in morally challenging situations. And it explains that individuals can disengage from the ethical implications of their actions if they view themselves as simply following orders. And so by shifting responsibility to the authority figure, individuals can justify their behavior and avoid feelings of guilt. Now, I want to kind of bring this back to the Milgram obedience experiment, because one of the most influential and controversial studies in psychology is Stanley Milgram's obedience experiment. Okay, this is from 1963. And in this study, participants were told that they were learning, part of a learning experiment, and were instructed to administer electric shocks to a learner who was actually an actor. And whenever the learner answered incorrectly, and although the shocks were fake, the participants believed that they were real. Now, what Milgram found is that a startling 65% of participants were willing to administer shocks up to the maximum voltage, despite hearing distressing pleas and screams from the learner. Even when the participants expressed reluctance, the experimenter, that is the authority figure, it was just a guy in a lab coat, but because you put a lab coat on, all of a sudden you're authority figure in people's minds, would calmly instruct them to continue, often resulting in full compliance. Now, what do you see in Milgram's experiment is some interesting things. First off, the authority's role. So the authority figure's presence and insistence significantly increases obedience levels. When the experimenter is not physically present or was replaced by someone with less authority, obedience rates dropped. Then there's the whole proximity to the victim. When the participant could see or was physically close to the learner, then obedience decreased. And so this suggests that if you put greater distance from the victim, that makes it easier for people to obey orders that might harm others. And then finally, group influence. And when participants observed others refusing to obey, they were less likely to obey as well. Conversely, when others complied, participants were more likely to follow suit, highlighting the role of social context in obedience. And so Milgram's experiments really kind of underscore how ordinary individuals could engage in actions that really kind of defy their own personal morals when obeying authority. And this leads to that significant ethical debate about the study's implications. Really, his work did spark some widespread interest in understanding obedience and how social situations kind of can override personal values, but it also highlights some struggles that occur in real life. So, for example, obedience is often essential in military, but strict obedience can also lead to some troubling outcomes. So, in cases of excessive force or war crimes, when individuals follow orders from a superior that are clearly illegal. There's also obedience to authorities in medicine can lead oftentimes to ethical violations. So, for example, nurses or medical staff might be carrying out the orders of a senior physician without questioning, but it might lead to the patient's harm. Or organizations where employees may obey orders from an executive, sometimes against their own judgment, especially when job security or advancement are at stake. And this dynamic can lead to ethical issues such as misreporting of data or engagement in some questionable business practices. So really, there's some profound ethical implications into obedience studies, and really goes to show that obedience is a complex, dual-edged aspect of social influence. It's essential for social functioning, but it has the capability and the likelihood of leading to harmful outcomes as well. And so it's important for people to learn the natures of obedience and to recognize that they always have the power to deny being obedient if their personal values are being violated, which I think is very important for us. And oftentimes we forget, we get tricked into weakening our own conscience and by saying that it's their fault because they told us to do it, when in reality we have our own responsibility in these cases. So there are some other interesting studies that go along these lines, and I just want to kind of highlight, I'm going to highlight 3 of them if I could, having to do with it's not about fixing behavior, but rather about how the situation can vary things. One is called the Hoffling experiment from 1966, I believe. The researcher's name was Charles Hoffling, and he really kind of demonstrated obedience in real-world high-stakes settings, where nurses in a hospital received a call from an unknown doctor who instructed them to administer a high dose of a drug to a patient. And this was an order that was, first off, against hospital rules, but surprisingly, 21 of the 22 nurses complied, even though they had no knowledge of who this person was, and they were aware that the dosage was unsafe. And so this study highlights how obedience to authority, especially in a very hierarchical setting like a hospital, can override a person's personal or professional judgment. Then there is the Philip Zimbardo famous experiment, the Stanford prison experiment in the early 1970s, where Philip Zimbardo set up a mock prison environment, and participants were randomly assigned to be either guards or prisoners, with Zimbardo himself serving as the prison superintendent. And the study had to be halted after just a week because the abuse got so bad. Because what ended up happening is that the experiment focused on roles rather than explicit obedience. But what ended up happening is the people in authority were given so much power that they started to abuse that power. And it just goes to show that this power of the situation can lead to harsh treatment of others. And then there's the idea of the Bickman's uniform study in the 1970s. And this is where Leonard Bickman conducted a study in which researchers dressed in different outfits. One was a security guard uniform, another was a milkman uniform, and another was just dressed as a plain civilian. And they asked passersby to comply to some simple commands like picking up trash. And the results showed that people were more likely to comply with requests from someone dressed as a security guard rather than in any of the other outfits. And this finding supports the idea that perceived authority, often symbolized by a uniform, can significantly increase obedience. So it's about perception. So there's perceived authority. So the factors that go into obedience are things like perceived authority, even if a person doesn't really have any authority. That's something that Bickman's study really kind of highlighted, is that symbols of authority, things like a uniform or a title or a prestigious setting, increase obedience. People are more likely to follow orders from someone they believe has legitimate power, even if they don't have any direct relationship with that authority figure. There's also the closeness of the authority figure. Physical closeness to the authority figure can impact obedience levels. That's what Milgram's experiment showed. And proximity to the victim. That when the consequences of obedience are visible or directly influenced, people are less likely to obey. So basically, if the consequences of obedience are negative, but they're out of mind, they're out of sight, then people are more likely to do it. These are all things that we need to be mindful of. And be careful that we act ethically. So when we know these things about obedience, we need to kind of incorporate them into our training, for example, for our law enforcement and military, to promote ethical conduct and discourage harmful blind obedience. And that's why in the military, there is that expectation. Yes, you are to follow orders, but if you are given an illegal command, you have a responsibility to deny that order. The same thing with in education, that it's important to foster positive ethical practices and to teach people that they do have a power of choice and that they need to be mindful of how authority can unintentionally promote unethical behaviors, because that can carry out into the rest of society as well. Now, finally, I want to talk a little bit more about obedience from a real world perspective from military. Because maybe I'll give you a couple of examples. We've talked about a few, but there are some big ones that I think are really important, because obedience, and this will come from history. Obedience is really kind of fundamental in of course, in military and law enforcement, and because there's this hierarchy, and following commands ensures coordinated action, which in turn ideally promotes safety. So soldiers and officers are trained to follow orders without hesitation, which is essential in very high stakes situations. But this emphasis on obedience can lead to some ethical concerns when orders contradict personal moral standards or legal standards. So, for example, there's something called the My Lai massacre during the Vietnam War, which really kind of illustrates the danger of obedience without moral reflection. And in this case, soldiers followed orders that resulted in the mass killing of civilians. And so, and the argument was, well, I was ordered to do it. Well, but you still have the choice, and you knew that it was wrong, and yet you did it. So that really kind of led to some training reforms that encouraged more critical thinking within the whole chain of command. The same kind of thinking can go wrong and has gone wrong in the history of healthcare. In hospitals and medical settings, hierarchy is very common. You have the doctors, then you have the nurses, and then you have the other medical staff, and they operate under strict chain of command. Now, while obedience to senior physicians' orders can streamline and save lives, it can also lead to medical errors or to unethical practices if junior staff members feel unable to question these orders. And so the Tuskegee syphilis study is a historical example where obedience to authority within the medical establishment led to prolonged harm to patients. So in this case, there was kind of a study done where they intentionally were infecting patients with syphilis. And this really, in order to study it, clearly very profoundly unethical and harmful. And this sparked the some real push for need for reforms in research protocols and treatment protocols. And that's why today we have ethical research protocols, because of the danger of falling into these obedience kind of ideas. Another historical idea is back in 2008, the economy basically collapsed around the world. And part of what happened was that a few executives made some decisions, and then the employees just followed along, knowing that what they were doing is wrong, but they still engaged in these practices. And so, like, for example, the Enron corporate scandal was driven by a culture where employees obeyed executives who encouraged very risky financial practices. And this led to widespread harm, not only to the employees, but to shareholders and basically to the whole world. Kind of fell into a depression because of it. All of this, I think, are things that we need to always be mindful of and be very cautious of how we are influenced and not giving up our own social responsibility. So again, I want to kind of go back and just review the core concepts of today's lecture. First concept is the idea of conformity. Conformity is when we adjust our behavior and attitudes or beliefs in order to align with the norms or expectations of a group. Often we do this in order to gain acceptance or avoid rejection from that group. And conformity is influenced by factors like group size, unanimity, and cultural norms. So we need to be mindful of that. We can be influenced by wanting to be part of this group. Then there's compliance. Compliance is strategies where a person socially engineers a situation, and then when we accept something or reject something, that sets us up for making other decisions. So one compliance technique would be the foot in the door experiment technique. Another one would be the door in the face strategy. The foot in the door is you make a small request, and then you make, and that sets you up to say yes to something, and then you make a larger request. That's a foot in the door. The door in the face is you make an outrageous request, they say no, but then they feel bad, so then you make a more reasonable request, and they kind of feel like they have to say yes. So these kind of strategies manipulate those basic principles within us of consistency and reciprocity and social proof, and we all kind of want to follow those. So that is how we get manipulated by those. And then there's the idea of obedience. And obedience is following direct orders or commands from an authority figure, often involving a very strong power differential. And obedience is shaped by factors such as authority legitimacy, proximity, and the presence of dissent. And so some key studies in this area include Stanley Milgram's experiment and the Stanford prison experiment. Now, let's take a look at the quiz question for this week. And which of the following techniques is an example of compliance that involves starting with a small request to increase the likelihood of agreeing to a larger request? Well, I hope you all know, because I literally just talked about it about 30 seconds ago, and that is the B, the foot in the door technique. Excellent. So, just to kind of close off here, I hope you see that social influence is very complex, that we have conformity, we have compliance, and we have obedience, and all of these things are deeply embedded in our human behavior. And it's important as we go through life to understand how the situation and the power of the situation can impact and influence us, combined with our own emotional desires and wishes to be accepted and to be liked by an authority figure and to please others. All of that plays into our decisions. But in the end, we are ultimately responsible for our own choices and our own decisions. Hope you enjoyed this week, and I will see you next week. You take care. Bye-bye.